Music is a renewable resource. Trends and fads come and go. The old makes room for the new. It's this strange, chaotic, Darwinian thing tied to demographics and economics and politics and technology and a ton of other things. But every once in a while, things sync up perfectly, and a particular genre takes over the world. Everything that's needed to make fresh, exciting music that everyone wants comes together in a perfect storm. Now, these storms last, on average, about 5 years. Things build up to a critical mass through the first 2 years. Then there's about 18 months where it seems the whole planet is focused on this one scene. And after that comes the long, slow, inevitable decline as the scene burns out and collapses under its own weight and bloat. We saw it with punk rock in the 1970s. We saw it with new wave in the 1980s. And we saw it with grunge in the early 1990s. Each of these scenes lasted approximately 5 years from start to finish. The most vital scene of the middle 90s could be found in the UK. For a while, the sun once again never set on the empire as Britpop became one of the dominant sounds in the universe. It was fresh, it was fun, and it was very, very cool. Not a week went by where we didn't hear from some new, exciting, unknown, fresh-sounding band. And for a while, everyone wanted to move to London. Even America, a place that hadn't cared about British rock since the 1970s, wasn't immune to the charms of Britpop. And then suddenly, it was over. What happened? Let's take a look. This is the rise and fall of Britpop, Part 1.
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
Confidence is a preference for the habitual voyeur of what is known as. A morning suit can be avoided if you take a route straight through what is known as. John's got Brewer's Group, he gets intimidated by the dirty pigeons. They love a bit of him. Who's that gut lord marching? You should cut down on your pork life, mate. Get some exercise. I get up when I want, except on Wednesdays when I get rudely awakened by the dustman. I put my trousers on, have a cup of tea, and I think about leaving the house. I feed the pigeons, I sometimes feed the sparrows too. It gives me a sense of enormous well-being. And then I'm happy for the rest of the day, safe in the knowledge there will always be a bit of my heart devoted to it. All the people. Nothing to do with your four-strung dirge technique, you know. And it's not about you joggers who go round, 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 round. All the people, so many people, and they all go hand in hand, through there, a park line.
Featuring an actor named Phil Daniels being very, well, being very English. That's Park Life, one of the great anthems of the era of British music known as Britpop. Welcome again, I'm Alan Cross, and if you were into new rock in the middle 90s, you'll know all about Britpop. And even if you weren't, you were at least aware of bands like Blur and Elastica and Pulp, and Oasis, of course, who managed to sell more than 10 million copies of their second album. This was the age of cool Britannia, of swinging London, of guitars and T-shirts adorned with Union Jacks. And for a short, shining period, this rainy, cold island in the North Atlantic was the place to be. To those inside and out, it was a genuine pop culture renaissance, a musical nationalism that seemed, to outsiders anyway, to come out of almost nowhere. But actually, of course, it didn't. These things never do. Britpop had its roots in a nationalistic stand against foreign invaders from America, armed with guitars and flannel shirts. See, grunge was everywhere in the early 1990s, including Britain. In a very short period of time, the British indie scene, a scene with a strong tradition of being homegrown, became dominated by American grunge bands. British alt-rock bands were being supplanted by foreign groups like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and STP. Why? Well, because there was a void in British rock at the time. The dance culture known as acid house had collapsed, and the so-called Manchester sound was in rapid decline due to the disappearance of the Stone Roses, that scene's leading band. Nature and pop culture abhors a vacuum, and this vacuum coincided nicely with the release of Nirvana's Nevermind, Pearl Jam's 10, and the rest of the grunge brigade, all of whom were more than happy to tour through Britain. The British music media has a voracious need to cover something. So they were all over the grunge invasion. Some of the best writing on Nirvana could be found in the pages of various British magazines in the early 1990s. This, however, did not sit well with a generation of British musicians who not only felt ignored, but rejected by their own country. And a select few of them decided to do something about it. The very first signs of what would be called Britpop started showing up in 1992 with a band called Suede. While most of the UK was going crazy for American grunge bands, Suede would have none of it. Singer Brett Anderson and guitarist Bernard Butler were upfront about this devotion to great, eccentric English rock stars, people like David Bowie and Roxy Music and Morrissey. There were also twinges of the more psychedelic end of the Beatles, and there was also a lot of that old-fashioned Mick Jagger swagger. Brett proudly sang with an accent using London slang. Meanwhile, Butler's guitar sound was reminiscent of the sharp, slashing glam sound of the early 1970s. It was all very, very, very English. The sheer opposite of grunge. Metal Mickey, one of the first great, very elegant, and very English singles from Suede. That was Suede's third single, released in September of 1992. These singles, all of which came with some very good B-sides, quickly brought the band to the attention of the British music press, which made Suede the poster child of the anti-grunge and growing anti-America brigade. Don't forget, America was in the Persian Gulf at the time, and George Bush Sr., not a very popular guy in a lot of parts of the world. It also helped that Brett Anderson was very articulate and always good for some kind of outrageous quote. Check this out. I'm not anti-American by any means, but I've never been impressed by it. Claustrophobic Englishness is conducive to great art. In America, there's no tragedy, no failure, no impotence, no premature ejaculation. Suede's sound and image made them stand out in a crowd of mostly faceless shoegazer bands and anonymous DJs and producers behind English dance club culture. Suede was not only seen as quintessentially English, but proud of it. While Suede was getting all this press, another group watched rather jealously. After a promising start, despite being falsely lumped into the whole Manchester thing at first, Blur had fallen into a rut after their first album. They just couldn't find their sound and were in danger of losing both their record deal and falling apart completely. Damon Albarn, Blur's singer, was openly jealous of how Suede had sped past Blur on the charts and in the media. He was also very disturbed with how American music had invaded the turf occupied by the proud British indie scene. Albarn decided that he had to do something. So he and the rest of the band decided to completely reinvent themselves for their second album. All those trappings of Manchester were jettisoned in favor of a different kind of Englishness, one that embraced David Bowie and the Kinks and the Beatles. Albarn also adopted a new manifesto and mission statement. If punk was about getting rid of hippies, he said, then I'm getting rid of grunge. It's the same sort of feeling. People should smarten up, be a bit more energetic. They're walking around like hippies again. They're stooped. They've got greasy hair. There's no difference. Whether they like it or not, they're listening to Black Sabbath again. It irritates me. The British music press loved Albarn for stuff like this, and since the British music media loved to set up and egg on a good fight, they gave Blur all kinds of ink. Of course, it also helped that Blur's music was once again as appealing as their singer's zingers in the press.
He's a 20th century boy with his hands on the rails, trying not to be sick again and holding on for tomorrow. None that eyes cracks on a seamless line. He's hanging on for dear life, and so we hold each other tightly and hold on for
For Tomorrow, the song that marked the beginning of Blur's transformation from this aimless post-Manchester band into a fresh leading force in some kind of new sound and attitude across Britain in 1993. Now, if Suede were all about paying homage to Bowie and Morrissey, Blur's roots were in the Kinks, one of the most English of English guitar bands of the 1960s and 70s, and of course The Jam, the proudly English mod revival band of the late 70s and early 80s. The third major player in the development of Britpop came along in 1994, and their sound was unabashedly based in the Beatles, the most cherished British band of them all, and the group was, of course, Oasis. The Gallagher brothers came out of a broken home in the Manchester suburb of Burnage. Noel was a former guitar roadie for another local band called the Inspiral Carpets. Liam, whose birth name is William, by the way, used to spend a lot of time breakdancing outside a local convenience store, he had this band called The Rain. In 1991, after Noel had been laid off by the Carpets, he staged, what can be best described as a coup d'etat on his brother's band. He took control and he renamed it Oasis, after a concert venue in a town called Swindon, where the Inspiral Carpets used to play a lot. Oasis played their first show with Noel on January 15th, 1992, and over the next 18 months, the group played a total of just 12 gigs. But one night in May 1993, they muscled their way into a booking at a Glasgow club called King Tut's Wawa Hut, where they were seen by this guy named Alan McGee, the owner of an indie label called Creation Records. Now, whether it was the music, or the performance, or the drugs, or the alcohol, it doesn't matter. McGee offered Oasis a contract on the spot, and within a year, Oasis would be the best-known British band in the universe.
Wanna
Oasis and Supersonic, their first commercially available single from April of 1994. We will obviously get back to them a little bit later. Beyond Oasis and Blur and Suede, there was one other emerging band that set the foundations for Britpop. We'll talk about them and illustrate how small this whole Britpop world really was in just a second.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
When you get right down to it, there were really just 4 bands at the core of the whole Britpop scene. And here's an example of how small and really semi-incestuous everything really was. Justine Frischmann is the daughter of an extremely successful and rich architect. After a private school upbringing and privileged childhood, she enrolled in the Faculty of Architecture at University College London. This is where she met a pre-Suede Brett Anderson, who was studying town planning and eventually architecture himself. Justine began hanging out with Brett, and they soon became boyfriend-girlfriend. They spent a lot of time with Matt Osman, one of Brett's best friends. After listening to loads of albums by the Smiths in the Fall and the Happy Mondays, as well as smoking a lot of dope and taking tons of ecstasy, the 3 of them decided to form a band in 1989. They were joined by a brilliant young guitar player named Bernard Butler. The first drummer was a guy named Justin Welch, but after 6 weeks, he was replaced by an openly gay guy named Simon Gilbert. This lineup of Suede lasted until Justine broke up with Brett in February of 1991. As they had grown apart, Damon Albarn of Blur kept pestering Justine to go out with him. Complicating matters, of course, was a serious rivalry and personal feud that had developed between Brett and Damon. Justine left Suede early in the summer of 1991, feeling squeezed out both musically and emotionally. She spent the next year concentrating on her architecture studies, something that she had neglected while she was a part of Suede. And she kept hanging out with Damon. And she kept coming back to the idea of forming her own band. This time, though, it would be on her own terms. None of the dramatic stuff of which Suede sang. She wanted short, sharp pop songs. That would be their thing. So, in the summer of 1992, Justine began hanging out with Justin Welch. Remember him? The original drummer in Suede? He was still associated with the band, sort of. He was bass player Matt Osman's roommate. For the first few rehearsals, the bass player in Justine's new band was Damon Albarn. But then Justine found Donna Matthews, a troubled teenager whose father had served 6 years in jail for trafficking in marijuana. And finally, there was a guitarist named Annie Holland. She was from Brighton, and she agreed to move to bass. The band used a bunch of different names at first. There was Onk and Dad and Kirby Grip. And then someone suggested Spastics Society. That morphed into Elastica, probably because that's an actual architecture term known as the Elastica Principle. It has to do with what happens when structures like buildings or bridges are forced out of their original shape. The first Elastica single came out on November 1st, 1993. It was released as a 7-inch single on a label called Deceptive, which was owned by a BBC DJ. You see what I mean about this scene being so small and semi-incestuous? Anyway, you probably know the song. It was a hugely popular thing as a single in the UK, and it was another part in establishing this still unnamed movement of new British indie rock.
Boy,
The winter of 1993-94 marked the real beginnings of what we came to call Britpop. But let's recap. Thanks to their first album, which, by the way, featured a bunch of songs that were written about Justine Frischmann, and the hype leading up to their second, Suede was the most admired and most talked about new band in Britain. Blur had rebounded from a dry period with a new manifesto of taking on American cultural imperialism and supplanting it with good old-fashioned British rock and roll. Oasis was still a few months away from releasing their debut album, but the hype around them was incredible. And then there was Elastica, a couple of neat singles, plus the irresistible tabloid fodder of her relationship with Damon Albarn of Blur and her old relationship with Brett Anderson of Suede. The indie scene began to strengthen in little pockets, like this nondescript Irish pub in Camden in North London called The Good Mixer, thanks to the fact that most of Blur liked to drink there. There was a gay bar called Blow Up, and for a while, everyone, musicians, fans, and hangers-on, all gathered at a club at the east end of Oxford Street called Syndrome every Thursday night. There was a new magazine called Select, which in the spring of 1993 began to devote many, many pages to this new generation of performers. Meanwhile, the NME, the big weekly paper, came up with a new name for this sound. They called it the New Wave of New Wave. Another magazine called The Face also began to step up its coverage. There were new attempts to have a new, privately owned, indie-friendly radio station put on the air in London as a way to counteract the stuffiness of the BBC. And to keep everything interesting, there was this slow, simmering feud and war of words between Damon Albarn and Brett Anderson, with, of course, Justine Frischmann caught right in the middle. With these foundations, there was a growing feeling that indie music, which, just to keep it simple, is the term the British use in the same way that we use alternative rock, was about to break out in a spectacular way. And it did. On April 8, 1994, the American grunge juggernaut came to an end with the suicide of Kurt Cobain. In a weird, strange way, this opened the door to everything that happened in British rock for the next several years. With American rock and its influence in decline, homegrown British rock had a chance to break out. And it did, with a series of groups and albums with the right sound, the right songs, and who just happened to show up at exactly the right time. First out of the gate was Blur, April 25th, 1994, just 3 weeks after Cobain's death. It was very Anglo-centric and extremely catchy. The Parklife album featured songs like this. Blur from Parklife, an album that appealed not only to British hipsters, but to, well, just about everyone. The themes were very English, proudly English, and had major mainstream appeal. The album and Blur became ubiquitous in Britain. There was just no escaping them, and it seemed that everyone in the country, young and old, was humming something from Parklife. Next was Oasis. Now, the hype about them had been building throughout the spring and early summer with a series of singles, not to mention all kinds of reports of bad behavior and drug abuse, which were dutifully reported in all the papers. Finally, in August, their debut album was ready. Now, it almost didn't make it. The first series of sessions were both unproductive and very expensive. A second attempt resulted in something useless, too. Finally, a sound engineer named Owen Morris was called in to salvage whatever he could from hours and hours of tape. Whatever he did to those tapes was magic, because when Definitely Maybe came out in August of 1994, the results were awesome. And it came out at the same time Blur was peaking. Perfect.
Maybe I don't really want to know how you got and grows, 'cause I just want to fly. Lately, did you ever feel the pain in the morning rain as it soaks you to the bone? Maybe I just want to fly, want to live but don't want to die. Maybe I just want to breathe. Maybe I just don't believe. Maybe you're the same as me. We see things I'll never see. You and I are gonna live forever. I said maybe I don't really want to know how you got it rose, 'cause I just want to fly. Lately, did you ever feel the pain in the morning rain? Have you sold you to the bone? Maybe I will never be all the things that I want to be. Now it's not the time to cry. Now's the time to find out why. I think you're the same as me. We see things I'll never see. You and I are gonna live forever. I don't really want to know how you got it grows, 'cause I just want to fly. Lately, did you ever feel the pain in the morning rain as it sold you to the bone? Maybe I just want to fly, want to live but don't want to die. Maybe I just want to breathe. Maybe I just don't believe. Maybe you're the same as me. We see things I'll never see. You and I are gonna live forever. Gonna live forever. Gonna live forever. We're gonna live forever.
Oasis and Live Forever, a song written by Noel Gallagher about his mum, Peggy. The final major Britpop album of 1994 arrived on October 10th. Brett Anderson called it Dog, Man, Star, which is his three-word description of how he had evolved. The hype was tremendous, and when the album came out, it set in motion a three-way battle to see which band was the biggest in Britpop.
Who says
As 1994 wound down, Suede, Oasis, and Blur were on everyone's minds across the UK. But they were far from the only bands benefiting from this new focus on Britain's domestic musical product. A look at some of the other players right after this.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
By the late spring of 1994, a new word had entered into the musical lexicon. Someone, and we're not exactly who, decided to abbreviate the concept of this new British pop into one word: Britpop. The first mention of the word Britpop may have been in an article on Damon Albarn in The Face magazine in May of 1994. In September, London's Guardian newspaper used the word for the first time. And then in January 1995, the NME began to use the word a lot. So, whatever. It was all part of the language now. In addition to the heavy coverage of Blur and Suede and Oasis, Elastica was also a factor, although their time would come the following year. After the release of Stutter in November of 1993, they took their time with the debut album. Instead, they went with a more measured approach, releasing a series of singles. This was one of them.
Is made. Made.
Well, Blur and Oasis and Suede grabbed the headlines, and with Justine and Elastica providing some extra gossip fare, these groups were hardly the only members of the Britpop brigade. There was Shed 7, a group whose singer dated Donna Matthews of Elastica. Echo Belly was a decent band from London fronted by a woman with a black belt in martial arts. There was Dodgy, a three-piece out of London who did most of their best drinking in Camden, the same bars that were frequented by Elastica and Blur. Hey, you remember Gene? They sounded unbelievably like the Smiths in so many ways, which was both an asset and a liability. They were formed in Oxford in 1993, and like Elastica, they were all about short, sharp, punk-influenced pop songs. This was the track that gained them entrance into the world of Britpop.
Dream. I was only 15. If only my brother
Supergrass and Caught by the Fuzz. By the end of 1994, it was obvious that something new and exciting was happening to British music, thanks to some very British bands. But there were also a few other factors lining up in sync with everything else. And in 1995, everything would explode. Back with a look at part 2 of Whatever Happened to Britpop, coming next.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
To anyone who was even halfway paying attention in late 1994, it was obvious that British rock was going through some kind of renaissance. There were all these new bands with all these cool new songs. The songs were new and fresh, yet because they were grounded in the British pop of the Beatles and the Kinks and the Stones, they were still somewhat familiar. That made it comforting and very easy to like them very quickly. The musicians themselves were colorful and newsworthy. Oasis started showing up in the papers on a daily basis. Writers kept tabs on Damon and Justine. Brett Anderson was openly feuding with his heroes, David Bowie and Morrissey. The newsstands were full of glossy magazines proclaiming the gloriousness of this new British rock and this new cultural nationalism. Even the old, boring BBC was rumored to be reconsidering the nature and makeup of its playlist to accommodate this new music. And underlying everything was the feeling that the government was about to change. The stuffy conservatives of Margaret Thatcher and her descendants were about to give way to the Labour Party, headed by this young lawyer who used to be not only a concert promoter, but a rock singer back in college. In 1995, Britpop would reach its peak. It was a glorious time when the music was awesome, and the parties never ended, and the drugs were everywhere. That's next time. Technical production by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.